Hello, Danielle.
Yes.
Are we starting now?
Yes, we have been recording for the past 3 minutes.
Okay.
Mhm.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, ASALH, for this opportunity to share my book, Running from Bondage. I want to begin by saying a few words about why I wrote Running from Bondage. Researching my first book, Claiming Freedom, introduced me to women who fled slavery either alone or with their family members during the late 18th century. This led me to question how widespread was the flight of enslaved women. And my research led me to the American Revolution, which, according to historian Benjamin Quarles, was the first large-scale slave rebellion in American history. So I wanted to tell the story of these women who fled or who attempted to flee slavery during the Revolutionary era. So Running from Bondage tells the story of enslaved women who escaped or who attempted to escape slavery during the Revolutionary era, a time period when chaos of war and lack of oversight made the escape of Black women possible in both the North and South. In fact, 1/3 of fugitives were enslaved women. My book consists of 5 chapters that explains why and how enslaved women escaped slavery and the challenging circumstances that they faced over the course of 5 decades from the 1770s to the 1810s. So I first unpack enslaved women's labor during the colonial period and their various resistance strategies, and then take a deep dive into looking at the lives of individual women who escaped. And what my book really underscores is the fact that enslaved women were not one-dimensional figures, but lived multi-dimensional lives as wives, mothers, sisters, and freedom fighters. And really, despite the limitations placed on enslaved women, they were able to contest their bondage through the liminal spaces of slavery. The pronouncement of Lord Dunmore's proclamation in 1775 and the Philipsburg Proclamation in 1779, offering freedom to escaped slaves, led to the escape of thousands of enslaved women as well as men. And in my book, I argue that motherhood, freedom, and love of family often served as a catalyst for attempted escape during the American Revolution. Time and time again in the advertisements that I examined, Black women ran away with their child or children. And in fact, enslaved women had just as much incentive to run away as did men, and perhaps even more, because they were abused physically, sexually, and psychologically. I wanted this book to be readable, so one of my strategies was to foreground each chapter with the escape of an enslaved woman. I wanted to give as much flavor as I could to the text, so I sprinkled the text with other facets of their experiences, such as how they dressed and what they wore while fleeing, what they took with them, and the obstacles they faced, as well as where they might have gone. I wanted to show the reader the tenacity, skill, and intelligence of these women. Now, I began this study really 5 years ago, and the research for this study brought me to the realization that there is so much more that historians can uncover in the lives of enslaved women. Although the evidence is fragmented, the experiences of fugitive women are far from unknowable. I used runaway slave advertisements, trial records of fugitive slaves, as well as an interview with George Washington's escaped slave owner judge. And what I also argue in the book is that instead of viewing Black women as at the margins of the American Revolution and abolitionism, it is important to see them as visible participants and self-determined figures who put their lives on the line for freedom. They protested with their feet by running away, which underscores the vital role of Black women in seeking to move the nation forward toward a more perfect union. My book dispels the idea that Black women did not flee or attempted to flee bondage during the Revolutionary era. Black women were an essential part of the long war against slavery and an essential part of the early abolitionist movement. Now, the story of Margaret Grant will surprise people. Margaret escaped slavery twice, first in 1770 and again in 1773. The second time she escaped, she was pregnant, but both times she escaped from Baltimore, Maryland. And in her first escape, she wore men's clothing and sought to conceal her identity by dressing as a waiting boy to an escaped English convict servant named John Chambers. So Margaret sought to escape by passing as both white and male, performing fugitivity in a way that Ellen Craft, another escaped slave, would do decades later. Also surprising is the fact that women not only ran away with immediate family members, but also in groups without established kin relations. They correctly perceived that their best chances for freedom resided with the British victory and a disruption of the existing social order. So of course, fugitivity is the central theme of running from bondage. Based on historian Marissa Fuente's definition, fugitivity refers to the experience of enslaved women as fugitives, both hidden from view and in the state of fleeing. It also signifies the fragile condition of runaways who came into visibility through runaway slave advertisements. So of course, women in bondage were not content, and running away or flight was one of the ways in which they registered their protest. Slaveholders lived with this inescapable reality on a consistent basis, and they did everything they could to get their property returned. Posting advertisements in newspapers was the most pervasive method used to secure the return of runaway women as well as men. Newspaper advertisements leaned heavily toward the physical, offering detailed information about the facial and bodily characteristics of their slaves, their origin and ethnicity, where they may have gone, and rewards for their return. The advertisements also reflected on-the-ground collective transformations of names and ethnic changes and identities. In other words, the fugitive body became a living and moving text of victimization, protest, and personhood. In terms of process, what I learned from writing this history is that fugitive women are not missing from the historical record, nor are they silent in the sources. On the contrary, fugitive women are everywhere in newspaper advertisements, trial records, and other official records. Fugitive women appear as expert witnesses in trial records, for example. The challenge for me was not locating sources on enslaved women's escape, but making sense of the fragmented evidence. I began to read my sources for the political and symbolic significance of clothes that fugitive women took with them or wore as they fled. Enslaved women like Margaret Grant, for example, appropriated the tools of the master, including his dress, to dismantle their enslavement. Margaret's escape generates new meaning and new tensions on fugitivity. Her escape represents what I call a polycentric narrative of freedom, in that she initiated escape multiple times. The escape of ordinary Black women is really essential to understanding how women built a culture and politics of resistance to slavery. Through ingenuity, countless enslaved women chose to abscond, providing evidence of their internal fortitude to think critically under pressure in the midst of gendered, racialized, and vulnerable moments in history. Under the daily threat of bodily harm, they imagined the possibility of freedom and transformed that possibility into a lived reality. In doing so, they outsmarted those who sought to subjugate and belittle them. So this story of Black women who escaped slavery represents an important part of Black women's political history and adds to the discourse of how African-American women organized in their communities, protested slavery and segregation, built institutions, and fought for equal access to the ballot. Black women have been in the forefront of movements to address inequity, social oppression, and freedom for the Black community for centuries. And this is a fight that really begins during the Revolutionary era. So thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have about my book.
Are we asking questions in the chat or are we allowed to unmute ourselves? Forgive me for not knowing the etiquette.
Everyone is allowed to unmute themselves, and you do have the opportunity to come on camera.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Professor Cook-Bell, and thank you very much for your book. I'm interested if you could elaborate a little bit for us about your life in the archive. In terms of looking at these advertisements, how did you come to draw out the kinds of details that you feel best support your argument? How did you come to a conclusion about how you would assess and evaluate what was a political act, what was a resistant act on behalf of these women? And how did you find the ways in which you engage with archivists and librarians in obtaining the information? Because often we're told that this type of information is a needle in a haystack. So if you could kind of share with us, that would be great.
Okay, thank you for the question, Dr. Duncan. And of course, the archive of the escape of Black women is very challenging because there are so many silences that are inherent in the archive and in the records that I examine. So I guess in terms of trying to tease out the political significance of Black women's escape, I think really the records that I examined, the runaway slave advertisements, really allow historians and myself to really read within the silences to imagine the varied meanings and possibilities that are inherent in those silences. So again, I discussed Margaret Grant, for example, and I think her life experience within the ads themselves tell us a great deal about what she endured. She had multiple sales throughout her young life. She was enslaved in the Caribbean, on 3 islands in the Caribbean. So I imagine what her life was like in the Caribbean and what she endured in the Caribbean. She was sold in South Carolina and in Philadelphia before she arrived in Baltimore. So the trauma in the archive, I think, is something that historians really need to examine with regard to the lives of Black women and their experiences in slavery. So Margaret was a woman who experienced multiple trauma in her life. And I think one of the important aspects of doing history and in terms of historical methodology is learning from what we can imagine happened to these women. And in that regard, I think it's important for historians to use their historical imagination that's deeply grounded and rooted in textual scholarship to reconstruct the lives of enslaved women. So thank you for the question.
Thank you. So,
So I would like to ask a question, please. I would like to know, in terms of your methodology, could you give us an overall profile of the women you examined in the runaway slave ads? And also, how many women did you actually explore in this, in your book?
Okay, sure. Thank you for the question. So in terms of numbers, not every runaway generated an advertisement. So the figures for exactly how many women ran away are not firmly established. But in my book, I examined really about over 1,000 runaway slave advertisements to provide a snapshot of certainly the ways in which African-American women contested their enslavement and engaged in really rebellion against the system. So in terms of profiling the women who I discussed in the book, the vast majority of women who ran away were between the ages of really 18 and 35. But I did see women, of course, as old as 62 who ran away with their daughters, with other family members. And of course, we cannot discount the experiences of young girls. So girls as young as 13 ran away, independent of anyone else. So in terms of the age range, it ran the gamut really from 18 to 35, the time period when most women are, having children, bearing children. And what I see in my work is that time and time again, women are running away with their child and with their children, and they're running away also pregnant, as was the case with Margaret Grant, who in 1773 ran away. And she was about 21 years old at the time in which she ran away the second time. So thank you for the question.
Yes, Dr. Bell, how did you come to this subject and decide to write about it?
I came across this subject as a result of my first book, Claiming Freedom, in which I came across newspaper advertisements for enslaved women and family members who ran away in the late 18th century. So researching my first book led me to this book. As most historians know, you find something from your first book that you can explore in greater detail. So that's what happened in my case. And I think that with regard to how this topic has really had a major impact on how I look at the idea of resistance and enslaved women's resistance over really centuries. We have to